Hello and greetings, everyone. My name is Haroon Sidat, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our book chat series as part of the Legacies of Learning project at the Islam UK Centre here at Cardiff University. This project is generously supported by the Jamil Foundation or Jamil Educational Foundation, and we're delighted that you've tuned in. Education, pedagogy, and learning have been subjects of detailed discussions by Muslim authors from the early Islamic period to this very day. Our Legacies of Learning project draws on a range of historical sources in the Islamic tradition in order to investigate notions of learning and knowledge production in a medieval and early modern Islamic world. More information can be found in the link to this video. Today, I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Farah Ahmed. Dr. Farah, welcome to our book chat series.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I know you're very busy, so I'm honored and privileged to have you on our book chat. If I can just introduce you for our viewers. So, Dr. Farah is a senior research associate at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. She convenes what's called the Cambridge Dialogues Roadmap for Renewal of K-12 Education in Islamic Context. This is an academic research network. Her research centers on using what's called dialogic halāqah to develop Shaksīyah Islamiyah through an Islamic infused or through an Islam infused thematic curriculum. I'm sure we'll get to know more about that very, very shortly. And this is translated into practice through the online international Islamic educator learning community. In 2002, Farah co-founded what's called the Islamic Shaksīyah Foundation, ISF, which runs Shaksīyah schools. ISF grew out of homeschooling projects, and for over 20 years, Farah has led the development of the Shaksīyah education model, which is a holistic, integrated approach to education that draws on classical Islamic educational thought and contemporary research. Farah has also served as a head teacher for 12 years and is now serving as the Director of Education and is the lead developer of Shaksīyah, halāqah, and holistic thematic curricula. She's also the author of Principles of Shakīyah Education and Dialogic halāqah, a guide for the Muslim educator, and we'll be talking about that in today's book chat. Today, we're going to be looking at, in particular, her booklet, which is called Principles of Shakīyah Education. I recommend very, very strongly that everybody has a copy that they read and they reflect upon and bring into practice. And I'm hoping that Dr. Farah can also talk about how we can bring some of the discussion points in that booklet into practice for all of us. And the principles that she has, the 7 principles that emerge in this book, are out of a quest that came about due to home educating mothers who sought to generate a contemporary education approach from the Islamic worldview and Islamic philosophies of education. So there's a lot I've said there, but I think a lot of people will be interested in things around homeschooling, which we'll talk about, because homeschooling is something that lots of parents are looking into, or maybe are a little bit scared to get into because they're so reliant on schooling or school education. So thank you for joining us once again, Dr. Farah. I'm really honored and privileged to have you here. I want to just kind of make an introduction or join the conversation by looking at the booklet, where it begins by outlining some of the challenges of Islamic education in the 21st century. Can you tell our viewers what they are, please?
So I think first of all it's important, first of all it's really important to sort of say, what do we mean by Islamic education? So you can mean lots of different things, and often people assume it's educating about Islam or to be Muslim. I think what I want to make clear in the chat we're having today is that on the whole, mainly what we're talking about is how is education understood in the Islamic tradition, from the Islamic worldview, from our sacred texts, from our philosophies, and what does that mean for us in the contemporary context today? And that will then shape how we talk about either educating about Islam or educating for Muslims to become Muslims, right? So I think that's important to make clear. Now, in that regard, then, essentially what we're talking about is education, just generically, and particularly when we're talking about K-12, which means that under 18 education, and we're talking about pedagogy, that's raising children into being adults. So when we're talking about education generically, people often equate that to schooling. And what I point out in this book is that that is a very modern notion. And when I say modern, I mean that's only been around since the late 19th century. So it's about 100, 150 years. And prior to that, education did not mean schooling. And what I mean by schooling is children attending compulsory, state mandated schools, which are structured in a particular kind of way from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. or thereabouts, and there's a particular structure, and they have to go through this in batches, as Sir Ken Robinson, who's was an amazing educationalist, pointed out, and that they are then like a time stamped almost, and it's like a factory model, and that isn't that's not something that's actually a coincidence. It's actually designed to be that way, because this contemporary schooling system that we all think is education, and when we say education, that's what we mean, is actually only something that was developed to serve industrialized Europe, and then it was exported out to the rest of the world through colonialism, essentially. And so this particular model of schooling is actually not anything to do with our Islamic tradition. Having said that, we have many Muslim organizations, many Muslim individuals trying to make this model work from the tradition. So I guess what the reason I always say that is what we do at Shaksīyah came out of homeschooling is because the significance of that is that as mums who decided we were going to withdraw our children from this factory schooling model because it did not align with our beliefs and our worldview and what we understood our role as parents was, how we understood the role of a child, how we understood what it was to educate children. Because of that, we were able to rethink it from a completely different way. Now, what you will see in the Islamic tradition is a lot of philosophy or wisdom, hikmah, however you want to talk. So when I say philosophy, I don't mean falsafa. I mean, but it's in our classical text, there's a lot of writing about education, about what it means to be human, how we fulfill the human potential, what is tarbiyah, ta'aleem, ta'adib. There's many, many things that we can draw upon. But to enact that into a world which has had some sort of dissonance from that tradition, in the sense that that world is now, we're functioning in these nation states, these post-colonial nation states, and these particular models. How do you do that? And our response was that we need to devise from this foundational text and these deep ideas certain principles that will guide the work that we do. And in doing that, we ended up with growing from small homeschooling projects. So we had I want to say about 15 different projects dotted around from sort of west of London all the way to east of London, like across. And there was a lot of communication happening. And eventually those two converged into two small schools called Shaksīyah schools. So those schools are a fruit of that work. And for the past 22 plus years, we have been sort of devising this model, trialing, and really trying to implement that. The reason they're called schools is because as much as we tried to say, oh, there's an alternative educational setting, within like the first week, everybody was saying, oh, you mean the school? And I was like, okay, no, we're an alternative educational setting. Oh, you mean the school? So everybody's just saying school. So I know that the word isn't ideal, but it was literally a battle that we could not win. So they are referred to as Shaksīyah schools, but they're actually alternative educational models that demonstrate in practice how these principles can translate this deep theory into something which is practical for our children today.
Thank you. And you were talking, we were talking about some of the challenges, and you kind of alluded towards those, which you talk about really at the beginning of your booklet, I guess. The booklet and the principles, which we're going to come to very, very shortly, they emerge from. You talked about these efforts of a group of Muslim home educating mothers who've been working together since the late 1990s. A lot of parents have heard of home schooling or home education, And again, I've used the word schooling again. Can you say even I fall into this trap of schooling? But can you tell our parents, our viewers, about what home education is, and how it's different or similar, and what are the benefits perhaps of taking this particular route, and maybe even encouraging parents to think about this?
Okay, so home education it comes up every now and again as a hot topic, right? In the Muslim community, but also generally. I think it's significant to point out that currently in the UK schooling system, the statistics are something like 20% of children are persistently absent, which means that's saying something. So remember that schooling is compulsory in many nations, and in some nations it's actually illegal to home educate. So for example, Germany, it's illegal to home educate, and this is the kind of freedoms that we have in Europe, right? But 20% persistent absence, people are putting it down to post-COVID, but a lot of people are actually putting it down to the way that schooling has become more and more controlled, and the fact that for about 14 years under the coalition and Tory government, we've had an approach to schooling in the UK, which means that children's interests are not being centered. There's no kind of focus on the kids. There's focus on, here's the knowledge, we want to get this to these kids, right? A very transmission based approach. And actually there's a parallel to that in many Islamic educational institutions, where here's a body of knowledge, we need to get this into the kids, right? So there's the kind of approach that people are taking. And the persistent absence is that kids are finding this, like, in what other context do we force human beings to sit in a particular room in a particular kind of way for a particular number of hours and do as they're told and do what they're told and do a particular discrete lesson and move on to the next one? Like, is this a natural way of learning? Is this how we had learning, as I said, prior to the schooling system? Where is the niyyah in all this? I'll come on to that later. In the intention, the motivation, one of the things that I think anybody can see is intrinsic motivation, where somebody is motivated to do something for themselves, is very different to them being told what to do. So what the reason I point all of this out is that homeschooling is a growing movement, and one of the reasons for its growing movement is partly because schools no longer know what they are there for, because we moved beyond the industrial age, we moved into the information age, we're now moving into the age of AI. And the schooling model hasn't shifted. It's still stuck in that industrial age. And yes, it might have worked quite well the way that things were streamed. For example, the UK, you would take out the people who weren't able to do O-levels, and I'm old enough to remember that, and put them into the factories, and they would be trained through school how to function in a factory and how to become like people who could serve the industrial model. And then you take out the academics and they go to your old-fashioned universities and they do the O-levels and the A-levels, and they are able to then run the country and run the industrial society that was there. That's no longer the case. And the generations that we're seeing growing up with technology, they're not responding to what's there. So because of that, a lot of people are dissatisfied with the current schooling system. So home education is generically something that is spoken about. But when you're asking what is home education, it's anything and everything, right? Alhamdulillah, in the UK, you can actually home educate, and you have the state cannot stop you doing that at all, which is brilliant. And the other thing that is there at the still the case is that you don't even need to inform, and you don't even to respond. And what that does is it's centering. From my perspective, I think it's centering the role of the parent. That the parent has a certain responsibility and has certain rights over how they are educating their children. And by giving them back that responsibility and accountability, what you're doing is enabling them to take that responsibility on. I actually have a serious kind of disconcert about the state taking that responsibility away from parents. But we are moving towards that even in the UK. So the reason I mention this is that at the moment in the UK, home education is whatever you want it to be, right? You can do whatever you like. And when we started out, we were doing all sorts of different things with our children. So people do things like forest schools, where they will spend days outdoors with their kids, and they're learning through interacting with nature. And they see that as a way of connecting things, like religiously oriented people see that as a way of connecting back to others' creation, making the children understand where things come from. educating them that, the food they consume doesn't just come out of a supermarket, and centering many things. Other people, they get tutors. I mean, some of our projects, we actually used to have like one teacher coming for a couple of hours a day with like 5 or 6 up to even 10, 15 children, teaching them. One of the things that we did when we were home educating, we taught back to what did the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam do. And we know that what he did, the way he taught, the core sort of pedagogy that he adopted was halāqah, right? And we thought about how did that halāqah operate at that time. And I know this is one of the principles, and we'll talk about it later, but it is connected to homeschooling, because what we were able to do as homeschoolers was to develop that halāqah in a way that it would be appropriate to children and enable move the education from this sitting at desks, in front of a blackboard and being told what to do, back to a much more organic and holistic and engaging and centering the child's niyyah, in lots of different layers that would completely have a different pedagogy to what is happening in contemporary schooling. So home education can be anything, really. It's what the parents want to do. And you have some amazing kids come out of home education, and then you have, and I will say that there are negatives, that sometimes parents just withdraw their children and they don't have the time, the capacity, the knowledge, or how to do that well, and it can become something which isn't necessarily the best experience for the child. But having said that, I am a great critique of our schooling system, so and I'm a great proponent of home education, inshallah. Yeah.
Perfect. So I just want to throw in a question here, which is that a lot of parents will be watching this, and they won't know where to start. So while they like the idea of home education, I've met parents like this in the mosque or in communities, and they don't really know where to start practically. And they'll be thinking, well, I'm working all day, or I've got work to do, I've got things to do. I really want to home educate, but I don't have the time. Where do I start? Is it really that demanding? Do I really need to sit with my child from 9 o'clock till 3 o'clock like they would do in school? So I just want you to kind of reflect upon that, if you may.
I mean, again, it's like everybody's context is different, and this is actually an Islamic principle, right? Is that we know, I think the ulama, they talk about this, that you have to know the student, you have to understand that student, you have to have that relationship, and everyone's context is different. So I could certainly give you tips and tricks, but it's not necessarily going to work for you, because it depends on how many children you have, what age they are, what your knowledge base is, what their interests are. Do they like sitting? Do they, are they great readers, or are they somebody that need to be in a playground after every half an hour? You know your child. And one thing I would say is have confidence in yourself. No one knows your child the way you know your child. The second thing I would say is that people often worry about qualifications. Now, the only time that in the UK you need a qualification is actually, the earliest you need it is GCSE, right? You could even technically bypass the GCSEs and at around the age of 18 get your kids to take A levels, because to go to university you just need A levels. But to get into a college or a sixth form, you'd need the GCSEs, right? So you need to think about this. And for me, what I would say is that you do want your children to have the GCSEs and the A levels, but up until the age of 14, you can do actually whatever you want, because the GCSEs is a specific syllabus. Technically, in some subjects, you may need some of the knowledge base that is taught in schools prior to that, like science and maths. But a lot of kids quickly pick that up. Now, in a previous life, I'm a qualified English teacher, and I remember once I did tuition many years ago, and I remember once having 2 girls come over from Iran, actually, and they knew nothing. They knew absolutely nothing, and I had 3 months to get them to do their English GCSEs. And when I say knew nothing, the language was new to them. Right? They knew a little bit of English, but it was a second language to them. Alhamdulillah, I managed to get them through so that they passed those GCSEs in 3 months, because there's ways of teaching that you can enable kids to do that. But the thing is that the reason I point this out is that people are very, very nervous. Like, what will happen to my children with the exams? And what I would actually say is that so long as you get good quality teaching that will help them pass those exams and jump through those hoops, you can do whatever you pretty much like. And what I would say is know your child. Of course, we want them to be able to read, to write, But that the age can vary. Some of my kids were reading like around the age of 3 because they wanted to do that. And there's ways to support children from about doing that. But other children in Finland, for example, we don't teach children to read and write till the age of 7. So there's many different approaches that you can take, but I would say that I mean I've seen some parents are saying, "Oh, no reading or writing until 7." I'm like, okay, that might work for a lot of kids, but it might not work for others. So I'm not hard and fast about it. This links to the principle of Shaksīyah, which again we can talk about a little bit more. The whole idea of Shaksīyah is using this term. Well, one of the key kind of tenets of using this term is because Shaksīyah moves us away from standardized education to centering the uniqueness of that child. It means personhood or personality or that specific uniqueness. And one of the miracles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our tradition is that every human being is unique. So my point about home education is what it facilitates is it allows you as a parent to understand your child, understand what they are wanting to do, what's good for them, and how you might want to respond to that. And that's the first thing you need to do. You need to be doing a lot of interaction and understanding what your child's needs are, and then drawing that out of your child, which is what one of the concepts of tarbiyah, and there's other ways of understanding education Islamically, but drawing that and helping them to fulfill that potential. I hope I'm answering your questions. I'm not sure if I
Yeah,
am.
no, I get, it's just that I get lots of parents, and we've had a conversation in our own home about home education ourselves. And your point about personal education is really important, or personalized education. I have 3 young girls, and they all learn in different ways. They have different interests. They develop in different ways as well. So it's very, very interesting to see that. So yeah, and I think every parent needs to think about personalized education.
Even if even if you're sending your child to school, as a Muslim, you're responsible that you are the one who's going to answer to Allah for your child's education. You cannot say, "Oh, I sent
Mhm.
them to school." Even if it's an Islamic school, you can't say that. Right?
Yeah.
You have to answer to Allah about, so you need to know your child regardless, whether they're in school or they're not in school. And that's the key thing that I would say is your relationship with your child, understanding them, knowing them, and being responsible for who they become. Some of it is out of your hands. The Anbiya, some of their children weren't believers, but that doesn't mean that you don't have that responsibility. You have to do everything you can, and often we're not doing that. We are taking them to these, classes or extracurricular activities. We're doing all of that kind of thing, but we're not spending that time understanding that child's character, who they are, and raising them and doing their tarbiyah so that they become the best person that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them to be. And that's a
Mhm.
responsibility that every parent has, and nobody else can do that for you. So I
Yeah.
think that's really important to point out as well.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of my other hats that I wear is working in the community as an imam. And I mean, we're constantly telling parents that, you can send them to the best school, the best madrasa in the evening, and parents are always searching them out, But ultimately, like you've said very clearly there, it's the parent's responsibility and the parent taking ownership and the parent completely becoming involved. A lot of parents think, well, I've sent them to the best school, I've sent them to the best mosque. It's their problem now, which is far from the truth. And I think that needs to be continuously repeated and re-emphasized in our communities. Um, the title of your book is Principles of Shaksīyah Education. We've been using the word Shaksīyah quite a lot, and we've talked about personal education. Can you kind of just give a quick overview for our viewers what you mean by Shaksīyah or Shaksīyah education?
Okay, so one of the key questions that we have to ask when we're thinking about education is what's the aim? What are you educating for? Right? And as I mentioned, the industrial model is the objective of that education was to create 2 types of people to serve essentially the industrial complex, right? One is workers, and the other was civil servants, and then rulers who tended to go to the private schools, right? So the public schools, as we call them here, are Eatons and our Harrows, right? That's what the model's for. And if that's what the aim of the model is, then for many years they did a good job, right? But what is the aim of education in Islam? Is that the aim? Is that what education is for? And clearly it's not. Now, Islam itself came as a deen. It came, one of the things I've written aside from this booklet, which is aimed at educators. I've written several sort of academic papers and more deeper kind of work around it. And there's a lot of work around the Cambridge Dialogues. But essentially, one of the papers I've written is about Hadith Jibreel and that encounter that we see where the Prophet ﷺ says he came to teach you your deen. So that in itself, that phrasing, that Islam is there as a deen, and that's what its purpose is. That if we start thinking about it, right, so the aim of education Islamically, most ulama would agree, is the elevation of the human person to fulfill the potential that is latent within them, the fitra, being drawn out through the tarbiyah, through ta'lim, through ta'dib, through various pedagogies, into what was traditionally seen as insan al-kamil. So some people would say Uswat al-Hasana, the best example of the Prophet Muhammad as a human being, and others would say insan al-kamil. Now, one of the things in our tradition, which is evident there, is that, like, for example, when we talk about some great persons or personalities in Islam, you would immediately perhaps think of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh and Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh. And so when we're saying that the Prophet ﷺ is the best example, and then we say that after him we have these two great examples. Now, both of them are very different to the Prophet ﷺ in their personality, right? In their Shaksīyah.
Mhm.
They're not the same. But we're saying that after the Prophet, these are some of the most complete human beings, right? But there's a difference in them. So when we say Uswatul Husna, we don't mean that we're creating like clones of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That's not what we mean. What we actually mean is that we are fulfilling the potentials that each human being in their own unique way can be the best human being that they can be as a Muslim, as an Abd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so one of the things that when I was looking at this and we were discussing it, so the idea of insan al-kamil, which is there in the tradition and is widely kind of accepted as the complete human being, or that's a really wonderful idea when you're thinking about education at an adult level. When you're thinking at a child's level, how do you get if the aim is a 6-year-old needs to become insan al-kamil? So I felt that there needed to be some bridging. And because of the gap of this uniqueness, and even in our Islamic education models, standardization has become, in fact, most educators I talk to, they cannot think beyond standardization. They really cannot think beyond that. And this is, it's almost like a paradigm shift, which people are very reluctant to come over to. And even though you say to them, well, where in Islam is standardization? And they can't find anything, they will still find it incredibly difficult to do that. So centering the term Shaksīyah takes you back to that uniqueness, that personality, that character of that individual, and it enables you to say that if the goal of education is the flourishing of the character of this individual child, which, by the way, for me, and I think for many ulama, includes being literate. And literate can mean many different things. So people are talking about digital literacy, people are talking about religious literacy, people are talking about cultural literacy, and you need to have artificial intelligence literacy, technical literacy. You need all of these kinds of to be literate is part of your Shaksīyah, because Shaksīyah is about rearing you to live in this world. And that's another point that I try and make, that educationally, we are educating for the akhirah through the dunya. Okay?
Yeah.
So we're not, what we're preparing children for when we say it's the akhirah, we're not preparing them for how they're going to live in the akhirah. We're preparing them for how they're going to live in this world. Right? Because and then that preparation will then connect to the akhirah. So Shaksīyah development is not just about the character, it's about the character as they live in this world. It's contextualized. And therefore our education needs to understand the context of these children. So the principle of Shaksīyah in the book, it's done it has many layers, but one of the layers it has is that you need to have structures. So you could call it human scale structures, but structures within the school, within any kind of educational setting, where the teachers have a sufficient time to get to know each child really well, so that they can act as a murabbi. They can act like a parent, a nurturer, a kindergartner, as in somebody who's raising a garden of children, right? And so that's something that is one of the key principles. The other principle is aspect of Shaksīyah is that is a two-way relationship. It's not just the teacher evaluating that child, but the child has to have that relationship with the teacher. And then another layer is a three-way relationship, because the child doesn't come on their own, it's their family. So a relationship with the parents, to work closely together to develop the Shaksīyah of this child, and the child taking some agency in that Shaksīyah development. There's other layers to this, though. I've done some work around Shaksīyah as a dialogical Muslim self in relation to double consciousness, which is becoming
Mhm.
more to do with the contextualization of Muslims, how we relate to modernity and so on. And I can probably maybe elaborate on that, but I think I've said quite a lot as to what the
Yeah.
principle of Shaksīyah might look like.
Yeah. So let's dive into the seven principles, if we may. I know we've talked about them, but let's kind of really go through them. And if I may ask, when you're talking about them, if you can talk about how they can be applied in practice as well. I know you do this in your booklet. So the first one is quite straightforward, but it's very fundamental, I guess, which is intention, or niyyah in Arabic.
Yeah, so we know that the one of the key hadith is that actions are by intentions, right? So we have to understand that Islam is not just a religion, or any religion is not such, where ritual is ritual for ritual's sake, right? Anything that you do, you need to be present in it. You need to know what and why you're doing it, and that's built into our deen. So the rituals are not or even valid, legally speaking, fiqhi speaking, without the intention, the niyyah, being performed in many schools, or at least being present, right? And I think that is very significant point. So what does that have to do with education? Well, as I said, if the aim of education is to develop Shaksīyah Islamiyah, or to develop this complete human being, if that's the aim, then what are you doing that for? So there's another layer of niyyah, so that you know what you're trying to achieve. And often people think, oh, niyyah is me understanding my objective. Well, objective in Arabic is hadaf. Forgive my pronunciation, it's probably terrible. But and the Arabic term is not niyyah. Niyyah is a slightly different term. And often when we're doing teacher professional development, teachers will say, oh, yeah, I do niyyah. I write my learning objective on the board. And I'm like, okay, but is that what niyyah actually is? Because niyyah is not so much what you're trying to achieve, but why you're trying to achieve it. Okay, so the niyyah there, in terms of me as a teacher, is what am I trying? Why am I trying to develop the shaksiyah of this child? It's because that's what I understand my role as a Muslim teacher to be. This because that I see this as an act of worship in itself. It's because this will help me develop my relationship to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. And likewise for the child, if they are in school, like sometimes you do an assembly, and first day back from summer holidays, brilliant time to ask the kids this question: why are you here? Ask them this question, and they're like, especially when they're new kids to the school, they'll be like, oh, I don't know, hadn't thought about it, right? Because my parents brought me, because that's what you do. You go to school because I want to be with my friends, I wanted to play, I wanted to share what was in my lunch, I want to tell everybody what I did in the holidays. And sometimes people might say, oh, to learn, right? The thing is that this is a whole question. Now, the reason kids don't know why they're in school is because we're still seeing as education as this schooling model. It's just what you do. You put kids in school, and then they come out, and then they have a job. And actually, funnily enough, even in Shaksīyah schools, you will get kids who will say, oh, so I can get a job. Now, that's a complete shift, because if you're in school or you're learning so that you can get a job, then that's what's driving you as a human being. So the idea of niyyah as a principle is to really try and do that paradigm shift, to get the teachers and the children to think, actually, learning for me is about being a human, right? It's about growing towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then how do we do this in practice? Well, we have, through our themes, we have like a year 7 theme called Knowledge and Knowing, where we explore it in depth around the age of 11. But earlier than that, in year 1, we have, I forget the name of the theme, but we do around a particular nasheed, a song, and particular books, where we explore what learning is for, why we're learning, and how we learn and how it helps us to grow towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We look at things like Shajar Tayyiba, good word is a good tree, and those kinds of concepts, and we bring that into not just our curriculum, but as I said, assembly, halāqah, also how we're interacting with our parents, how we're interacting with the teacher professional development. It's worked through the model in many different ways, but it's always going back to this is what we're here for. We're not here for the qualifications and the results. That doesn't mean that they're not important, but that's not what we're here for, because you can put, Islamically speaking, you could put as much effort as you can. But an examination system, which again to me is alien to Islam, the kind of mass examination, standardized exams, standardized testing, you could have a bad day and you can fail. You have some people, many people who then go on to make lots and lots of money because they're very clever people, cannot do exams. They have a fear factor of it, right? And the other thing that exams do is, and we can maybe talk about this in Taqdeer, I'm probably sort of digressing, but the Niyyah is, first of all, it is partly what you want to achieve, but much more deeply why you're doing what you're doing. And so that's how that principle operates.
Thank you. Brilliant. That was very, very useful. I made some notes for myself, actually, as a parent. The most obvious question was, why are you here? So I'm going to ask my children, why did you go to school today? I'm going to let you know what kind of response I get once I ask them. The second principle was Shaksīyah, personalized character education. I think we've covered this already quite a bit, unless you want to add something
No,
to it.
that's fine, inshallah.
Yeah. The third one's an interesting one, which is quite important for me at least, which is Qudwa. That is teaching and or leading by example. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, please.
Yeah. So again, like one of the things is that you have the Niyyah for the learner, but then what is the role of the teacher? And how do we understand what a teacher is? And instead of going towards, well, okay, let's define what is a muallim or murabbi and so on, which we can do and is really important. The purpose of the principle of qudwa is to explain to teachers that they have, not only are they role models, but they also have a leadership role. That in our tradition, Islamically speaking, anyone who is educating is given some respect in the community. So even if you're a primary school educator or you are teaching maths, you have a responsibility to see yourself as somebody who is carrying that responsibility. And so that's one dimension to it, because often is to move away from teachers as technocrats. Because often people, and we see this increasingly as they're coming through, the younger people, they come in, they want to be told what to teach. And if you say to them, well, you need to contribute, what do you think you should be teaching? Which is how traditionally it was the alim always had that responsibility, right? Even when you're educating a young child, you're not just saying, oh, this is XYZ, here's a list of what we created the lists. In our tradition, we did create the list. It's not that you don't, but you need to know how and when to teach that to that particular child. So the principle of qudwa is support educators to really rethink what their role is. Coming back to the role model aspect, we have this in our tradition of sitting with the teacher, because being in the presence of the teacher will help you learn in many ways. In which case, the time that you're spending with your children, the way that you're carrying yourself, your own character, who you are, how you behave, has a huge impact. And you see this, children, it does have a huge impact. And a lot of women know this anyhow, because you do this in the home. So for example, in a school, you will go into a class where every teacher has their own personality, and that's brilliant. There is no one way that is the right way of teaching. There's always ways to improve, always needs to be ways to improve. But you'll go into a classroom, like I remember we had this one teacher who was so quiet. She barely spoke. In meetings, she didn't want to say very much. And you'd go into her classroom and she'd be sitting there at her desk, and the children would be sitting there, and she'd move around, and they were all just so quiet. And she managed to create this really peaceful atmosphere. And then you'd go into the next classroom, and you've got an incredibly bubbly person who's so excited about what they're doing, and they're making the kids, and the kids are like all over the place, and that's fine as well. That's also good teaching. So the point is that you're role modeling what it is to be, what your Shaksīyah is. And that's why the role modeling principle comes into it. So that what you're probably picking up now is that these principles are not A equals B equals C. And that's why we don't call them, like, I don't know, rules or whatever. We call them principles because they have within them, and this is Islam, terms and principles have within them the capacity to have so much impact, so work in so many different layers. So one of the things we do is explore these principles again and again with the teachers so that they can, and the parents, so that they can understand them in deeper and deeper ways, inshallah.
Yeah, beautiful. I want to move on to principle number 4. We've talked about it as well already, but it's worth exploring it because you have it down as Islamic oral pedagogy,
Yeah.
halāqah, if I've got it right. So I'm just interested in what you mean by, because a lot of people are used to, so for the benefit of our audience, I guess we need to explain what oral means, because there's two spellings. There's ORAL and there's AURAL. And while they're related, they are distinct in some ways as well. So I wonder if you could talk about that, please.
Yeah, of course. I mean, okay, so in education, we now have a term called oracy, which is gaining more and more traction. And that is about the skills of speaking and listening. And I think when we were chatting just before the program, we were talking about podcasts and how podcasts are operating, and people are increasingly learning through podcasts. And we were having this discussion about how prior to, of course, texts have been important in the Muslim world for a long time, since after the Battle of Talas, when paper became more readily available. But our tradition is also an oral tradition. And learning through dialogue, through listening, through hifz itself is an oral practice, memorization. There is a huge amount of oracy embedded in our tradition. And I was making the point that I actually feel that podcasts as a mechanism may help us go back and emphasize that a little bit more. Now, language, there's so many layers to this. I mean, just FYI, we do like weeks of courses around halāqah as pedagogy. This is not something that you can capture in a few minutes. However, language is also embedded as part of in our Islamic philosophy of education. One of the key characteristics of the human being that elevates them as the best of creation is the capacity to have language. That Adam alayhi salam is taught the names of things. And that, so the capacity to understand language, use language, is really, really fundamental to educating the Shaksīyah. So oracy and halāqah, I would say, is an oral pedagogy. It's also a dialogic pedagogy in the way that we do it in Shaksīyah schools and how we're supporting teachers. And by the way, we have got guides for teachers, we have courses for teachers on how to use this as a pedagogy. We also have a curriculum, and that is available, which effectively, we don't do Islamic studies, we have halāqah. And we encourage the halāqah to be a place where children are going away, they're doing some thinking homework, they're going away thinking about things, they're doing some research homework, which might involve looking things up, but it's often encouraging them to go and talk to their parents, their older siblings, grandparents, friends, and think about something, come back. And then the way the halāqah operates is through key questions and talking points. So the teachers facilitate a dialogue about certain concepts and connect those, and then embed that dialogue so it begins to connect those concepts together. So what you're doing is you're building an aqliyah. So that's one layer of halāqah. So that aqliyah is like essentially a way of thinking, a mentality, if you like, a conceptual to think through.
Yeah, aqliyah, for the benefit of viewers, is it's kind of developing the intellectual, I guess, wit and sharpness.
It's partly the intellectual wit and sharpness, but I'm using it in a slightly different term and in a slightly different way, which is it's like a conceptual map to think through, right? It's a mentality. Okay. It's how you understand the world. And I actually, there's a big debate, like, well, a lot of people, like, I use the term worldview as well, and we need to maybe sort of problematize that term. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is aqliya, the Arabic term. It has a lot of capacity for what we're trying to do, because by doing that, what you're not doing is you're not saying to children, here's a list of things that you need to know as a Muslim, and then memorize it and then go away, and there's no thinking about what that actually means for you as a person, what it means for your society, and so on. And that's often done as an add-on. But what halaqah does is it centers the concept and the connections between those concepts and this aqliya, and enables the kids to start thinking about these things, what it means for them. We ask that question repeatedly. Okay, so we've discussed, for example, Salatul Rahim, the responsibilities that you have to your family. What does this mean for you practically? We ask this question. Can you give us an example? We've discussed sabr. Give me an example when you didn't have sabr. And then the children share. And what we encourage teachers to do is also share, which, if you have a small group and the teachers develop that confidence, actually that has a huge impact. Is that when you're open about how you're implementing these things in your own life, how you're thinking through these things, you're role modeling that for the kids. It's a very different type of pedagogy. And when we're thinking about halaqah, as I said early on, is that one of the key things that we thought about when we were homeschooling is, what did the Prophet ﷺ do? And when we consider the al-Arkam, I mean, many of the halaqat that we have across the world today, and halaqah happens everywhere in all Muslim contexts, and there's formal, informal, and I've written a lot of papers around this. My PhD thesis was on this. But the Prophet ﷺ, if you think about the context in which he was in teaching these halaqah, he was teaching around the Quran as it was revealed. The Quran was speaking directly to the people at that time about their situation and
Yeah.
what Islam had to be for their situation. So everybody's coming to those halaqah. They will come to a point where they're coming to just learn from the Prophet, but they're coming to try and understand why they should believe in this. Okay, why, and what it means for their society. So the early halaqah would have been full of questions. And in fact, if you look at the Quran, the Makki Surat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking the questions. He's asking questions that enable you to reflect upon things. Have you thought about this? Have you seen the people of this? The Quran is replete with questioning. And that questioning and that dialogue, and I mean, one thing that's really fascinating to me is a Christian colleague pointed out to me. He said that the Quran addresses you as like, it's like a dialogue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking directly to you. And with Hadith Jibreel, we talk about how Jibreel interacts with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the dialogic dimensions of that are really powerful pedagogy in our tradition, and it's almost lost. I'm not saying it's completely absent, but we'll see it at the higher education level. But it's almost like we've moved away from that over time. And what I'm trying to talk about is renewing that. So children, our entire education model, curriculum, pedagogy is built around the prophetic pedagogy of halaqah, and it centers and anchors everything else that we do. So I mean, actually, if you find that in the booklet, the halaqah is given a lot of time, and more than the other principles. And it's not, I mean, I just put it as one of the 7 principles, but it has a very significant place in the education model as a whole.
Absolutely. I want to move on to the next one, which we haven't given much attention to, but I think it's important. Your next principle, which is a Balāghah, I think it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it's Balāghah, Quranic eloquence. Now, I'm thinking about the average Muslim family who perhaps memorizes the Quran if they're blessed and fortunate enough to, and they'll master how to at least be able to read the Quran, but not quite understand what the message is. So, can you tell our viewers what you mean by what you mean by Balāghah, and why it's important as a principle, and how we can practically bring it into life?
So, I mean, if I can say first that one of the ways that we understand Shaksīyah, and I don't think this is in the booklet, but is that when our aim in terms of our education model is not to produce ulama, okay, But what we are trying to produce, we use the term Shaksīyah, but somebody mentioned to me it's like almost like muthaqqaf, as in like a cultured person, right? So what we're trying to say is we want our young people to have sufficient understanding of their deen and its impact in the world, like its potential to impact the world and themselves and their communities, to be able to then function as not just ambassadors of the deen, but they are the ones creating that renewal, right? That's our aim. And so what we're trying to do is have them literate enough in their Islam to be able to enact that and to be transformative for them and for their societies. So now Balāghah, where does that fit in? As I said earlier, language is inherently embedded in our educational tradition, in our deen, in how we conceptualize things as Muslims. So eloquence in language is really fundamental, and the Balāghah principle focuses on Arabic, but we also talk about language in terms of even English, like enhancing the children's vocabulary so they're able to access the Balāghah eloquence in English. But in Arabic, one of the things we try and do, and again, let me link this back to as I was talking about the conceptual map, is if we look at our Islamicate languages, Islamicate meaning societies that centered Islam, so whether that's Persian, Urdu, Bahasa, Turkish, they are replete with Arabic terminology. And increasingly in the educated English-speaking Anglophone kind of community that's emerging, we are becoming more familiar with using Arabic terminology. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the Arabic terms in themselves, partly because of the root system, but partly because of the richness of the Arabic language, have a capacity for meaning that is multi-layered or multiplex, right? Now, what we're trying to say in Balāghah is, of course, we want all our children to be fluent in Arabic and speaking in Arabic, and we teach Arabic every day. So we have halāqah every day, we have Arabic every day, and we do, and some of our kids do come out of that, and we have children who are now in their 20s who have, non-Arab speakers who become incredibly proficient in their Arabic language. However, if we know that not everybody will achieve that, but what we do want them to have is deeper understandings of the Islamic and the Qur'anic and Arabic terminology that can enable them to have this Shaksīyah Islamiyah that we're talking about. So that's one of the way that we talk about Balāghah. And also, just a final point is that the capacity within the Arabic language enables a type of renewal that we need at the moment, because we are still emerging in a post-colonial space, trying to decolonize our thinking, decolonize how we're approaching things, and to renew Islam for an age which is very different to the when perhaps our societies were a bit stronger. So that capacity within the language is essential to do that. It enables us to think about the world today and come up with new ideas, but stay close to the original meanings and the teachings of our deen.
Yes. And that's a great challenge today. I think every parent is fully aware, especially living in, I guess, even in Muslim majority context, there's a challenge, but minority context, more so. The sixth one is, we've kind of touched upon this one, but I'm going to bring it up for our viewers, Minhajul Shāmil, which is this idea of Shaksīyah holistic curriculum. So we're focusing, I guess, more on the content. Can you tell our viewers what you mean by that?
So what we mean by that is, as I said, everything is built around the halāqah. So what we do is we organize our halāqah. We have a curriculum where, any curriculum needs to be that you're covering the right types of knowledge that the children need at particular ages, and then you go circle back and do it a bit deeper and so on. So we do that in terms of the Islamic studies and the history element of the halāqah. But then around that, we then, when you translate that into what you call schemes of work or planning for what you're doing in the halāqah, we do that thematically. So as I said, we might have a theme that is, for example, China, or we might have a theme which is circles and cycles, and we embed the halāqah through thinking about those themes and making connections. And then by doing that, we're able to build the rest of the subjects, so English and art and science around that. So Minhajul Shāmil is this holistic curriculum, which our curriculum is designed, the work that we're doing is from the age of 3 to 14. As I said, when you hit 14, in most contexts, you need to start thinking about exams. So we're aiming for those two first phases of a child's growth, which are the kind of really foundational phases. And so there's a holistic dimension to that. So at this stage, they're making a lot more connections between these kind of subject areas than understanding these disciplines as a whole, which they can do later on. And there's a thinking behind this, because when you silo subjects, you make learning less meaningful for children. And so if we're learning to become better shakhs, better mu'min, better believers, all the different layers that we might describe in terms of that, then we have to understand what the purpose of that learning is and how it connects to each other, and how our language will help us understand the geography around us, why geography is important to our deen, and why it might be important to us helping people in society, and creating all those connections so that children are not seeing education as, oh, I learn this stuff, then I sit a test, and then I get a grade, and I get a star, and then I go on to the next test, right? Which
Yeah.
is a very impoverished way of understanding what learning is. So it's shifting from that into this much richer, very deep curriculum, which enables children and has a lot of flexibility in it for children to go out and explore the things that they want to do. And that's built in different kinds of ways. Okay.
Brilliant, thank you. We talked about assessment. You alluded towards exams, and I think we both agree that exams aren't always the ideal way to assess for learning. And I've had some unsavory memories of exams and going through exams. Um, and of course, this isn't unique to schools. Many madrasas have exams where students sit down and simply just memorize a bunch of information. I mean, my daughters will sit down and memorize what breaks wuzu, ablution, for example, and what are rituals of Hajj. And I often wonder, how is that helping them learn when they're just learning a bunch of rules? But you talk about taqdeer, which is your seventh principle, and this assessment for learning. I wonder if you could shed more light on that for our viewers, please.
So it's not just assessment for learning, it's assessment for the learner, which is
Hmm.
slightly different. Okay, memorization is important. It's not that memorization isn't important. Hifz is a very important aspect of our tradition, and it does need to be centered. But the question is, what are you memorizing? And as you said, to memorize a list of things that break your wudu, kids will soon forget that. How do we actually learn about wudu and what breaks it? Through living, right? It's being with people and seeing and understanding. How do you actually learn about Hajj? You can memorize all the things, but when many madrasas and schools will try and enact the Hajj with the children, try and do some role play, but you actually learn when you perform it, right? But the taqdeer principle is about just inverting that whole idea that education is to pass exams to get a job, and taking that entirely away. So up until the age of 14, we don't have any kind of standardized testing, right? That doesn't mean the kids might not do a spelling test or do an end of unit assessment. We'll do those things, but there's no standardized testing of like, you get this percentage and that tells you your progress. Instead, we have quite a complex way of a learning journey, which then, as they get older, we start calling them learning journals, of tracking their learning through various different means, and being able to put in lots of points of reflection, lots of peer assessment, lots of self-assessment, lots of teacher-learner aspects. Now, going back to why this, traditionally speaking, the way that an evaluation and assessment is, perhaps the term evaluation might even be better, would happen is through the ijaza method, right? Is that the teachers would give an ijaza to the student to say that they have mastered this particular aspect, whether it's a book or a particular skill set, and then they can now go on and usually they would say teach that, but at least that they've mastered it. So it's the teacher making that evaluation. So we try and go back to that kind of route, and which is why one of the other principles we have is was built into the Shaksīyah principle, is that have the structure small enough so the teacher's able to know the children well enough to be able to do that. Which isn't that, it sounds like it's hard to achieve, but it's not, because most schools will have a teacher and a teaching assistant to a class of 30. So if you split that, you'd have 15 per adult, which means that you can, so there's mechanisms for doing it, right? So the idea of taqdeer is to link back to the Niyyah, why you're educating, link back to Shaksīyah, how you're educating, what are you trying to achieve, and to embed mechanisms or ways of evaluating and assessing that is for the learner, for that unique learner's journey, as opposed to even just for learning, or certainly not for like sort of like the kind of standardized testing, which is to give grades, because there's this movement. I mean, as I said earlier, 20% of children persistently absent. 1 in 5 kids is not coming to school every day. Why is that happening? And I don't know if there's movements in the wider, like in UK society, something called More Than a Score, which is really trying to tackle this incessant obsession that we have in our schooling system of testing children. So these are kind of the sort of philosophical reasonings behind that principle.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I want to kind of end with one question, if I may, and feel free to take it in any direction that you so desire. Our work, the Legacies of Learning project, is an important project, and I know we're glad to have you as one of our key advisors on the project. How's the work that you're doing related to our project, our Legacies of Learning project?
I think there's a huge synergy between the two types of work, because what you're trying to do, correct me if I'm wrong, is you're trying to bring out the conceptualizations of education, the philosophies that were there within classical texts, and how those legacies sort of developed over time, and where how they lead us to where we are now, right? And what I'm trying to do through not just Shaksīyah schools, but also the Cambridge Dialogues Project, which is Renewal, which is an international network of academics, which we'll be launching a website with we've got some position papers, we've got some toolkits, trying to get school leaders, educators, even and Islamic scholars involved in answering these kinds of questions, to completely rethink education. Again, building on existing work that's been done. So I'm thinking about the World Conferences of Muslim Education, the kind of work, seminal work of people like Naqib al-Attas and Sayyid Hussain Nasser, Ismail Farooq, Sayyid Ali Ashraf, some of these giants of the late 20th century who are trying to grapple with these problems. So what I'm doing is, both at that academic work I do at Cambridge and the work I do in Shaksīyah schools, is translating those things into practice today, right? Is what is happening on the ground, how are teachers operating, how are schools operating, what's happening within classrooms, how can we create that kind of change, what's happening in homes, how are parents thinking about it. So I think there's a great synergy between the two projects, and I do think that we need to create a space, more spaces, and I believe our institutions need to do this, our emerging institutions of higher learning that we have, a lot of them are online, to create spaces for synergies between the work that educationists do and academics do and ulama do, to try and offer a different model of education to the world. Because I believe that, and I present a lot of mainstream non-Muslim conferences, and I get an amazing response back that the ideas that Islam has about education, the legacies of learning that we have, can offer really some powerful ways forward for a sector that is really having a bit of an identity crisis at the moment. So that's how I would answer the kind of synergies between our two projects.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I wish we could continue for longer. But what I would say for our viewers is, please continue conversation by sharing this podcast, this book chat, with your friends and colleagues. There's a comment section. I know Dr. Farah is very busy, but she is incredibly approachable. So do reach out to her, and she's more than happy to help where she can. A lot of parents will be interested in a conversation around home education. So Dr. Farah, thank you so much for joining us on our book chat, and we hope to have you again on very, very soon. Please do keep an eye out for future publications. We have a monograph. We're hopefully going to have a book that's more accessible coming out of the project. And we look forward to hearing from all our viewers very, very soon once again. Until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.